Hello and welcome to another Painter Lore video. For those of you who haven't watched my previous Painter Lore videos, the idea is I paint something whilst talking about the lore for it. I've previously done a Painter Lore video all about the Bretonnians, I then did another one all about the undead, so it seemed only logical that this one should be about the Bretonnians and the undead. We are looking at Circle of Blood. Ooh. For those who hadn't guessed from my silly little promo, Circle of Blood is one of 5 campaign packs that they released back during 5th edition Fantasy, and it's my favourite, as well as being the only one that I've played all the way through. So without further ado, let's dive into the background of Circle of Blood. First things first, I'm going to be painting for this video something from my Tale of Four Gamers army, but also a model that was released at the same time as Circle of Blood. It's the Bretonnian hero on Pegasus. In the campaign pack, this was a model that was essentially released to be used as the Bretonnian Duke of Aquitaine, Duke Guillaume, or at least the living Duke of Aquitaine. Circle of Blood was released at the point before the Vampire Count's army books was released. So if anyone starts wondering during the course of this, oh, what bloodline was the Duke of Aquitaine? We don't know. It was before there were bloodlines. This is when undead was still a single unified army composed of both kind of vampires, zombies, white schools, but also the kind of mummies, carrion, screaming skull catapult stuff that we would come to associate with the Tomb King's release. I'm going to paint while I talk. First things first, I'm going to need some Talassar blue to do his blue heraldry. And I'm going to just check what colour it was on the original. It's not on there. It's on my reference sheet. Blue at the front, red at the back. Okay. Take the dite off. There we go. The background of Circle of Blood was so good that not only did it appear in the campaign pack, but it also got its own novel by C.L. Werner, released by Black Library several years later. And what's quite interesting is there is a difference between the background that appears in the novel and the background that appears in the campaign pack, but the novel actually includes an account for why that divergence is there, and I'll address you on that as we go on. But so, first of all, what is the Circle of Blood? The Circle of Blood is an age-old story of death, betrayal, evil overcoming good, and good old-fashioned sort of knights and chivalry. Essentially, the story starts not long after the birth of Bretonnia, not after Guy the Uniter had united all the lands. One of the earliest dukes of the kingdom of, the dukedom of Aquitaine is sent off to fight in the First Crusade in Araby, and whilst there he is known as El Sif, the sword, because he is one of the greatest warriors that Bretonnia has ever known. And unfortunately, whilst there, he becomes, in the background in the campaign pack, he becomes subject to an unknown, unspecified curse. Some dark denizen of Araby sees fit to corrupt this noble flower of Bretonnia, and so he becomes deathly ill, but expresses his desire to only die back in his beloved Aquitaine. So they convey him back to Aquitaine, but once there, he eventually succumbs, dies, and then rises from the grave as an immortal vampire. He then sets out, essentially driven by bloodthirst and madness, to seek to carve out his own kingdom of death in Bretonnia, turning all the land into a kingdom of the dead under his rule. Yeah, to this end, he is eventually thwarted by I think it's the grandson of Guy le Breton, and is imprisoned in a tomb, and everyone believes that is the end of him. You know, head cut off, stake through the heart, that's it, done. You'd think that would be the end. Anybody who's ever seen a vampire movie knows that is not the end. The story picks up several centuries later, still, I think, before the days of Warhammer the Old World, but now he has been released from his tomb and seeks to resume his activities, essentially, as he was engaged in before his defeat by the previous king of Bretonnia. Everybody else has moved on. I mean, everyone's forgotten the story of the Red Duke. He is little more than a nightmare story to be told to children, and that's it. The story then is broken up over 4 missions in the campaign pack, which roughly tell the progress of the Red Duke between his initial release from his tomb up to his final battle against the now living Duke of Aquitaine, who I am currently painting flapping on this Pegasus. That is the night battle at Mersal, which is essentially one of the Red Duke's necromancer thralls seeking to raise up all the undead heroes that were buried under what is now a fairly low-level peasant village, which is defended by a single Holy Grail knight. Then there is a battle at the Wizard's Tower, where the Red Duke, again, essentially seeking to prevent himself from being thwarted as he was before, seeks to challenge the damsel in the Tower of Sorcery that represents the Lady of the Lake in this part of Aquitaine. And again, he's aided by an evil minion, a new troop type that wasn't available. It was a hero at this point, a new hero that had never previously been available to the undead, but would become a staple, and that is a Banshee. Then, having battled against the Bretonnian forces at the Tower of Sorcery, the Duke then seeks to march on the capital of Aquitaine, on the Duke's palace, and the Duke, meanwhile, seeking to buy time for reinforcements to come from across the dukedom, sends his son out with a group of knights errant and other fast-moving cavalry to destroy one of the key bridges, working on the principle that the undead can't cross running water without the aid of sort of like a bridge. It will slow the Red Duke's movements down and enable him to muster as much of his forces as he can before the final battle at the Battle of Seren Field, outside the Duke's palace, where good and evil duke it out, no pun intended, for eventual control of Aquitaine, and from there potentially Bretonnia and the whole old world. So, not exactly a low-stakes story, and one that's filled with the pathos of the corruption of honour in terms of what was once a great and noble knight becoming this twisted and dark thing. The campaign pack, I should probably talk a little bit about that, and then I'll talk about the novel. And then once this is dry, I'll stick some red on the Pegasus, and the Pegasus barding. Oh, actually, before I do that, I can stick the blue on the Duke himself. So, the campaign pack, like I said, is based around 4 battles, 4 missions, and the way these campaign packs worked was they came with a set of cardboard scenery, which, in some of them, the scenery is only really used for one single mission, as I mentioned during my scenery video. In this one, what's quite cool is that the scenery is used one piece in each of the different battles, which I think is quite nice. It means that you feel like you're getting proper use out of the scenery, rather than getting the cardboard scenery that came in the pack and only using it for a single game. The pack also came with this book that I've brandished at you a couple of times, which gave you both the rules for each of the scenarios and also, quite cool, a rundown essentially of what forces had historically been used, and by that I'm assuming they mean what forces they used when they test fought it at the studio, and that gives you the idea that you could use those forces if you wish, or you can use the other thing that came with this, which is the battle scrolls. So I'll quickly show you 2 sets of battle scrolls that came with this. Blue for the Bretonnians, yellow for the undead, and each of these contained a special character for the army. So, for example, the Grail Knight hero from the Battle of Mersal, or the Duke Guion, the Red Duke himself, or Werner the Necromancer, or the Banshee, but a special character for each of them, some of which weren't that special. They were just, a regular, for example, like a White Lord with a particular magic item. Others were entirely unique to this pack. And while it didn't say you could use those in future games, I mean, realistically, there's nothing to prevent you from doing so, provided you're playing with friends. But so it also contained a rundown of what units could be used in that army, and even down to some little tactical tips, like what you could do to make sure that you won the game, or what, the best way to play the game through was. Contained then within the book is, like I said, the background and some beautiful art. And let's all just take a moment to admire, I mean, I'm wearing my t-shirt in tribute to it, let's all take a moment to admire the beautiful cover by Mark Gibbons. This is one of my favourite pieces of undead artwork of all time. But then, contained within the book, there was the story of the Red Duke, including an original new piece of art commissioned just for this, of the Duke himself. And again, the Duke got his own model. The Duke model was my Vampire Lord for many, many years, whilst I was using my undead army. There was then a map that shows the relevant area of Aquitaine that we're talking about, together with a little plan showing where each of the battles were fought. So from there, it gives you the different scenarios. So the scenario for how to fight the night battle at Massal, how to set up the scenery, most importantly, what the victory conditions are, who goes first, all of the stuff you need to play that scenario for each of the different scenarios. And then after that, it gives you the, as they call it, the Ballad of the Red Duke, which is a rundown of what forces were historically used, together with what I think is quite nice, historians' comments, which again is almost like the game's designers setting themselves up as historical figures or historical authors commenting on this historical event and really putting a tactical slant on how they say the battle went. But so if I go through with you, first of all, each of the scenarios. Night Battle at Massal, then, as I've said, is this battle by the Red Duke's Necromancer. So you've got Skeleton Horse, Werner the Necromancer. He's a level 2 Necromancer with the Cursed Book. He comes in with Skeleton Horsemen, Zombies, Skeleton Warriors, Ghouls, and Ghosts. And the key way, the only way really that he can win is if he can get within the grounds of the graveyard that is set up in the middle of the board, and the set came with some cardboard gravestones, and cast the Raise the Dead spell. Then he will raise up the undead heroes from days gone by, and the end result of that is that in the final battle the Red Duke will get multiple heroes, as many heroes as he can fit into his points, to help lead his units into battle. Offset against that, we have the Holy Knight, and the Holy Knight is, again, he comes with a unique virtue, the virtue of utter serenity that's never appeared anywhere else, but if you're ever fighting against undead, I guess he would be a cool character to use. As long as the Holy Knight is within range of Werner, no necromantic spells can be cast within 6 inches of him. So as long as you keep him inside the graveyard and keep him in range of Werner, then Werner cannot cast the Raise the Dead spell and win that scenario. So the tactical hints, as you might guess, is keep the Holy Knight alive, keep him safe inside the graveyard, and kill Werner if you can, because once Werner's gone, that's it. The undead can't win the scenario. To aid him in this, he had only the benefit of men-at-arms, bowmen, squires, and 1 unit of mounted knights-errant and mounted squires, which could come in as reinforcements. Essentially, I guess, if you imagine some peasant jumping on a horse and riding hell for leather to the nearest castle to raise the alarm, and the group of knights-errant whooping it up to go and win their spurs, taking on the undead menace. What is interesting as well is there is a disparity in points between the two forces. So whereas Werner the Necromancer gets 1,500 points to try and complete the scenario, the Bretonnians only get 1,000 points. And of that, only 400 points of those can be made up of the reinforcements. So it's not like you can bring 1,000 points of Knight-Errant unit that's just a huge Death Star that smashes through everything. No, you've got to depend upon your peasants. Moving on then beyond that, the army that the Banshee gets to use. The Banshee, as I said, was an entirely new creation. We know it now in terms of its present in Age of Sigmar. It was present throughout all the later versions of the Undead book, from the Vampire Counts book onwards. It was a relatively simple mechanic whereby you'd roll 2 dice, add the enemy's leadership, and everything over 10 is equal to wounds taken by that unit. In this, the Banshee has a much different effect. She has a 1d6 chart that does all kinds of weird things, like forcing units to take a leadership test, or invigorating units of the undead as if they just had the Van Helsdance Macabre spell cast on them to make them move and fight more effectively. Beyond that, though, she gets 1,500 points again to take on the Bretonnians, but the Bretonnians get the same at least. But she gets a lot of fast-moving stuff, I guess, to represent the Red Duke sending a fast-moving flanking force out to challenge the Bretonnians. Blue is dry, so I'm just going to move on to some Blood Red. Blood Angels Red Contrast. Contrast over white works so well for Bretonnians. But yeah, the battle is all about whether or not they can kill the Grail Damsel in her shrine and thus deny the lady's favour to the Bretonnian forces later on over the course of the campaign. And how that's represented essentially is you get a unit of Grail Knights to assist Iselda. So how that works is you've got a unit of Grail Knights to assist Iselda in defending her tower, but if you failed in your duty to defend her, then no Grail Knights would be allowed to be present in the final game. That's a huge disadvantage for the Bretonnians. Grail Knights are completely immune to psychology, they're immune to fear, they're immune to panic. exactly what you need if you're facing a large army that mostly causes fear and terror and panic and what have you. So Iselda was a level 3 sorceress, and she had access to the Amber Amulet to help her recover wounds. And the scenario was based around the idea that you had 2 locations. So the Bretonnian army had to split their force between 2 sections. There was the Tower of Sorcery itself, and if Iselda was near that, then she gave specific bonuses to the army. And there was then like a sacred pool to the Lady of the Lake, and if Iselda was near that, then she gave certain boons to the army. So if Iselda was near the Tower of Sorcery, then she gained an extra Winds of Magic card every phase, whereas if she was near the Sacred Lake, then her and whichever unit she was leading was immune to psychology. So again, very helpful if you stuck her, for example, in a huge unit of men-at-arms, for example, because she was on foot, then she could hold them fast and try and hold ground in that location. But on the other hand, extra magic, helps you throw spells at the Bretonnian, the undead army, which, aside from the Banshee, who was a level 1 wizard, I don't believe, no, they had no other spellcasters. So in this one, the Bretonnians had the sort of magical advantage, the tactical advantage in that regard. But what you don't want to have, and one of the tactical hints it gives, is don't have Iselda out on her own, because the Banshee, Rosa the Banshee, which she was called, could fly and would quite easily flap her way over and make very short work of Iselda if given the opportunity to do so. Just get this red on here. This isn't actually going to be my Duke in my Tale for Gamers army. This is going to be a hero on a Pegasus, but can't do anything less than paint him beautifully. Moving on then to the Race for the Bridge. Race for the Bridge then was essentially one of my favourite scenarios. It had an all cavalry army for the Bretonnians, led by Duke Richemont, the son, impetuous young knightly son of the Duke. Again, it's one of those ones where the Bretonnians are outnumbered, so they only get 1,500 points of their army, but everything in their army is mounted. There's no need to take any men-at-arms or bowmen or anything. On the other hand, that does mean that they've got no peasant bowmen, no ranged fire whatsoever to throw against the undead. The undead, meanwhile, have the army of Lord Falk, the Dark Knight, who was, again, it was a model that was released expressly for this kit. And actually, Age of Sigmar recently did a tribute to him with the new White King on mounted model, which is a tribute to that classic metal miniature that was released for Circle of Blood. But again, so he's got mounted wights, he's got skeleton cavalry, he's got wraiths, and you better be afraid of wraiths if you were playing 5th edition fantasy, especially against 5th edition undead. And the Bretonnians have to decide how they want to split their army. They can have a certain amount of their army on one side of the bridge. They have to have another portion of their army on the other side of the bridge. At the end of the game, based upon whether or not the undead have managed to get more units over the bridge than the Bretonnians have on that side of the bridge, that shapes whether or not the scenario is won. The victory conditions for this one were, again, a massive advantage to the undead. If they succeeded, the Bretonnians would be 500 points less in the final battle, the Battle of Seren Fields. So, Battle of Seren Fields, then, I think we have to mention, it's a 3,000 point Warhammer Fantasy game. If the undead have won the first game, then they're rocking up with a bunch of heroes and numerical advantage if they've won the third game. They're also allowed to use the hero from any of the previous battles that they had won. So if they had won the Race for the Bridge, then they get access to the Dark Knight. If not, then he's dead, he's not allowed to be present in the final battle. And much the same for the Bretonnians. If they had won that first battle, then the Holy Knight is available to appear to help support the peasant troops of the Duke's army and to, most importantly, thwart some of that necromantic spellcasting in the final game. If he's not, then that's it. That advantage is gone. The Red Duke himself was a monster of a vampire. Again, we didn't have bloodlines back then, but he rocked up with... I'll just find his sheet, there it is. He rocked up with the Blade of Leaping Gold, which gave him an additional 3 attacks. So bear in mind that this is a vampire who already would have had 4 attacks. He clocked his way up to 7 attacks at strength 7. And they gave him magical armour, which would be a kind of a precursor to what the Blood Dragons got in their bloodline powers in the Undead book, which came out not 12 months later. But the Armour of Blood, which gave him exactly the same save as a heavy armour, but it didn't interfere with his ability to cast spells. So essentially, mounted on a Barded Nightmare, he had a 2-up save, whilst still being able to throw out 3 spells a turn like any other vampire lord. The Duke, meanwhile, which I'm happily painting up, came on a Pegasus. He was armed with the Giant Blade. So whereas the Vampire Duke went for extra attacks, the Knightly Duke, the Living Duke, went for the extra points of strength. I guess, given that the vampire's toughness is 6, he probably needed that strength if he was going to try and take him on. Strength 7 he clocks in at with the Giant Blade. He also got the Grail Virtue, making him immune to psychology, and they gave him the Virtue of Devotion. From memory, I'll just check my Bretonnian book, I believe that gave him rerolls to hit if his opponent's basic strength stat. No, that's the Virtue of Valor. Virtue of Devotion, completely immune to magic. That's pretty good. So it means that if the vampire wanted to cast, for example, Hand of Dust or any of those high-power kind of combat spells like Curse of Years that would just decay the Duke and his Pegasus into dust in seconds, the Duke's Virtue makes him completely immune to that, which, yeah, I think that's a fairly major advantage. So, how did it go in the historical comments? How did it go? Well, night battle at Massal then, the historical forces, it was a huge block of 31 men-at-arms backed up by the Holy Knight, so 32. I mean, I'm guessing you'd maybe rank that as 4 ranks of... 8 ranks of 4 or 4 ranks of 8. I'm not sure which way round you'd do that. But then 10 squires, 10 mounted squires and 12 bowmen. All the mounted squires, meanwhile, armed with spear and shield for that extra point of strength on the charge. And 6 knights errant as well. I mean, that's maybe slightly less than I would have taken. I might have taken less mounted squires and more knights errant. That's my choice. Werner, meanwhile, took a big unit of 12 skeleton horsemen. A further 5 skeleton horsemen for that extra burst of speed. Because I guess wanting to get into the graveyard and break the defenders before the reinforcements could arrive, and then 11 skeleton warriors to escort Werner, really not much at all, and 20 ghouls. How did it go for them? Well, as I described, the skeleton horsemen ploughed in through the ruins fairly quickly, scattering some of the peasant folk who just really didn't have the ability to stand their ground. The Holy Knight stood there hacking his way through the skeletons, but there was a white champion in the skeleton unit, and at the key moment he struck down the Holy Knight, killing him, and that broke the back of the peasants' will, and they fled for the hills, allowing Werner to raise the undead champions. 1-0 to the undead then, giving them access to all the heroes they might want in that final game, and denying the Bretonnians the presence of the Holy Knight in the final scenario. Defence for the tower, on the other hand, was again not perhaps the best forces chosen. Iselda took just 2 units of bowmen, 20 men-at-arms, and then 6 Grail Knights, 6 Questing Knights, 8 Knights Errant. The Banshee, meanwhile, rocked up with, again, those 12 skeleton horsemen, 6 mounted wights, 6 carrion, crucially, so a bunch of flyers, and then 2 chariots and some bat swarms. Iselda deployed near the tower with just the bowmen to back her up, the rest of the knights all gathering over near the sacred lake. And, I mean, this proved very much her undoing, because it left the Banshee and the Carrion, the flying troops, free to just swoop on down on the sorceress, butcher her sort of meagre defenders, and then as she tried to flee across the board towards the knightly defenders, she was cut down, denying the Bretonnians the presence of the Grail Knights in that final game. I think that's a fairly crucial step. So it's 2-0 to the undead so far. Race for the bridge, at least, did swing in the other direction for the Bretonnians. So Richemont took 10 questing knights that he was leading with his questing vow, 11 knights of the realm, and then 2 units of 6 knights errant. The Dark Knight, meanwhile, brought those 12 skeleton horsemen, 4 wraiths, 5 mounted wights, again a small number, only 11 skeleton warriors with a white champion, ghouls, bat swarms, and a chariot, and a screaming skull catapult. The knights advanced across the board, were able to hold up the Black Knight's armour, the Dark Knight's forces for long enough for the sappers to demolish the bridge, crucially denying the Red Duke the time he needed to launch a surprise attack upon Duke Guillaume. And that therefore means that at the very least, even if they're denied all manner of Grail support in the final game, they do have the benefit of even points values in that final game. So 2-1 to the undead as we go into the final round. I'm not going to read out the full forces that were used at the last battle, except to say that there were 20 Knights of the Realm in one of the units. The Red Duke used a combination of forces that was very similar to what had been used in the previous rounds. Duke Guillaume tried to use the Giant Blade to kill the Red Duke, swooping down from on high in a charge from fly high on the Red Duke, causing a wound on him, but then getting butchered by the Red Duke. However, before he could kind of relish his victory, the rest of the Bretonnian forces overran his position, and as time ran out, the Red Duke was run down by questing knights and forced to, in the background at least it suggested, forced to flee into the forest of Chalon, securing victory for the Bretonnians, and I guess the new Duke Richemont, who takes over from his father. I'm going to resume painting now because I've done an awful lot of talking while handing over books. What I want to talk about now is the background as it appeared in the novel by C.L. Werner. So, like I said, the background, and what's quite cool, I suppose, is the background as it appears in the campaign pack is supported by the background as it appears in what looks to have been the playthroughs. What they did for the novel is they established it essentially as if the background that is from the campaign pack is what is known from histories in Bretonnia. And the book even starts with a troubadour travelling around, earning his scratch, singing the story of the Battle of the Red Duke versus the Duke Guillaume, and earning, a decent salary, a decent sort of living, going from tavern to tavern, singing the story. In what I could only assume is an homage to Interview with a Vampire, he gets back to his room at the tavern one night after performing to find a stranger there waiting for him, who informs him that this is not in fact exactly how things took place, but that he is fortunate that the stranger is there to tell the troubadour the true story of what took place all those centuries ago in the days of the Red Duke. And that at the end of him having told his tale, he will offer the troubadour a choice. Very, very Christian Slater, Tom Cruise vibes coming from that. The story as it's then presented by the stranger then is that way back, as we had originally in Circle of Blood, way back at the dawn of the Bretonnia, there was a crusade launched into Araby, and Le Chiffre, the sword, the blade literally, is the noblest warrior of Bretonnia at that time and leader of a force that's essentially kicking arse all over Araby, trying to drive back the forces of the Sultan that have invaded Estalia. And they also establish at this point a bit more depth to the history of the Red Duke, making him the brother-in-law of the current... In fact, making him... Is it brother? Making him the brother of the current king. So essentially, almost a Richard III vibe in that regard. But a noble character, rather than the way Richard is portrayed in Shakespeare. He is essentially attacked by assassins whilst he's resting at a wadi and mortally wounded and taken back to his tent to die. Then, whilst he's laid there, Skaven from Clan Eshin come to try and finish him off because he's such a mighty warrior. They want to make sure that he can't support the forces of Bretonnia in the future. Whilst he is bemoaning the fact that this is going to be the way that he goes, a mysterious stranger comes into the camp and butchers all of the Skaven and any of the other assassins who would have sought to kill him, and then, not really offering him a choice, forces him to drink some of the blood from a wound on his wrist, thus damning him for eternity. He still gives all the appearance of that he's going to be knocking on death's door anytime soon, and so he expresses his desire to be taken back to his beloved Aquitaine to die. The king's father-in-law, meanwhile, wants to assume control of the dukedom of Aquitaine, and there's even a suggestion that he may have been in league with the Skaven that have come to try and finish the duke off. But so he lays a plan to ensure that the duke never returns to Aquitaine, having key joists sawed through on the timbers of the ship that is to carry him back from Araby back to fair Bretonnia. It's only due to the loyalty of one of his retainers that the Duke survives, even though all the rest of the ship's crew are lost. But nonetheless, he makes it back to the Castle Aquitaine. There he lies on his deathbed, eventually succumbing to what appears to be a terrible illness. Upon receiving word of his death, his beloved wife throws herself from the battlements to her doom. Only minutes later, of course, he returns from the grave, much more potent, a monster of darkness, and upon hearing word of his wife's demise, goes completely mad, butchers all around him, and seeks revenge upon what he sees to be those who have done him wrong, his brother, his brother's father-in-law, and even the loyal vassal who brought him back to the castle, such that he wasn't then able to die and join his wife in death. He then musters a massive army, marches out to try and conquer Aquitaine, is thwarted by the then Grail Damsel of the Tower of Sorcery, together with his brother, who is then King of Bretonnia, and having been run through the heart, he resumes his mortal countenance, much like happened in a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer episodes. They'd have that kind of moment where the vampire appears human and then switches to the evil form. He switches back from kind of the bat-eared, monstrous visage to being that of the noble knight that his brother once knew. His brother cannot then see the Duke's body defiled further, so ignores the advice of the damsel to have his body cremated to ensure he doesn't return from the grave again, and instead has a huge tomb erected for him, and has the body interred within it, confident that that way at least his brother's legacy can live on, of all the good that he did and the evil that he did after his death can die away into history. Night falls, the Duke rises once more from the grave, only to find himself trapped behind blessed walls, interred within this tomb, desperately thirsty for blood, unable to escape, and goes completely batshit crazy. 400 years go by of him waking up every night, still trapped, still imprisoned behind these blessed wards of the lady, tearing and pounding on the walls, just losing what little fragments of sanity he had left. The story then picks up with the descendants of one of the vassal who carried him from the ship, and the vassal who conspired to see the ship's timbers sawed through by the king with the king's brother-in-law, who have been essentially kind of a Shakespearean-style feud between their noble houses, one killing the other killing members of their family, fighting and a feuding, as they might say. In trying to gain an advantage over his hated foe, the descendant of the conspirator takes up league with a witch who promises that she can draw some of the vitality from the Red Duke's tomb and imbue him and his most sort of trusted knights with that power so that he can venture forth and finally crush his enemies and once and for all lay to rest their grudge by just expunging the other noble house from fair Bretonnia. It doesn't quite go to plan. Instead, they simply break the wards on the Red Duke's tomb, at which point the Red Duke breaks the walls of the tombs himself, emerges crazed with thirst, immediately drains the blood from the witch, drains the blood from anyone living nearby, and then takes the corrupted, the evil baron, and impales him on the sword tip of the statue that was left standing above the tomb, before raising him from the dead as a zombie to kind of twitch and moan and writhe, impaled upon this sort of stone sword as a marker against the sin that his ancestor committed. He also then raises the witch from the dead as the first Banshee, so that's where we get Rose of the Banshee from, but he doesn't kill the peasant necromancer Werner, who was assisting the witch, because he can see a greater use for him. So we have our cast of characters set. One of the servant knights of the corrupted baron rides to Castle Aquitaine to warn the Duke, but is ignored. As soon as he mentions that it was part of this feud, the Duke Duke Guillaume doesn't hear any of it, he doesn't want to know, sends him packing on his way. In desperation, then, he rides to the castle of his enemy, the castle of the other rival barony, only to arrive at the moment that the Red Duke has arrived and is in the midst of butchering everyone within the household. The only one he's able to get away with is the Baron from that household, and the two of them form this uneasy alliance on the basis that if both of them go to the Duke with word that the Red Duke has returned, then he'll have to believe that it isn't simply part of their feud, because why else could they possibly find common purpose? That red is dry, so let's put some blue on the shield, and then I'll move on to the armour. Meanwhile, the forces of Werner the Necromancer go to Mersal, where the rest of the heroes, the vampire thralls in this version of it, rather than being just the White Lords, because of course by this point the Undead book has been out for a while, the vampire thralls from the Red Duke's army are imprisoned, dispatched with instructions from the Red Duke to free those of his army who still reside there. This includes the father-in-law of the previous king, the one who had conspired against the Duke back in the days when he was first arisen from the dead. As punishment for his crimes, the Red Duke had horribly maimed and crippled the the father-in-law, but then raised him from the dead in that fashion so that he would have to live out a longer life as a kind of twisted, hunchbacked character. They free the rest of them. The Holy Knight who is there is defeated, and the rest of the thralls are freed. However, Werner is under strict instructions to re-imprison the crippled knight, and duly does so back inside the Grail Chapel, because he's not welcome in the Red Duke's army. However, he does raise the Red Duke then raises the Holy Knight from the dead as a dark vampire, newly created thrall, which is where the Red Duke, Duke Falk, comes from. That's where we get the final member of our cast of characters from the Battle Scrolls. Not a wight, but in fact a dread vampire thrall. Warriors from the two feuding houses arrive too late to do anything other than witness this, but they then carry word to the sorceress at the Grail Chapel, and they arrive just in time. The Banshee had been dispatched to kill what the Duke, in his madness, thought was still the original sorceress, still thinking he's living 400 years in the past. He is waging war against enemies long dead. But they are able to arrive just in time to essentially exorcise the Banshee's spirit, save the Grail Damsel, unlike happened in the refight in the Cruise campaign pack. They save her, and then she, together with them and the Grail Knights who are present at the chapel, go to the Duke to tell Duke Guion what is actually occurring. A council of war then happens, and the decision is made that the Red Duke's armies need to be slowed, partly because one of the things that they say he is marching on is not simply marching on Castle Aquitaine, but the huge burial mounds from the pre-Bretonnian horse lords that once occupied this land. They're worried that if he gets to those mounds, he'll be able to raise that vast army of the undead from the grave, and then nothing will stop him. He'll be able to march across Bretonnia and turn the entire land into a kingdom of the dead. Duke Guion's son, Sir Richemont, the rash young questing knight, then agrees to undertake the mission to slow the Red Duke's march by leading a team of sappers to the ford and essentially sabotage the bridge so that their movements can be delayed. The two, I suppose, our focus point characters, the two feuding knights, go with him as part of his entourage. And he is able to destroy the bridge, much as happened in the refight scenario. However, in the book, this doesn't do any good at all, because all that happens is the myths about undead being unable to cross running water prove to be entirely false, and his undead legions just march into the river, march along the bottom, and march out the other side. This is not entirely unplanned for, though. A backup plan is in place. They bring out the banner of the previous Duke of Aquitaine, the former king that was the Red Duke's brother, and they start flying it, and it just drives him mad. It drives him back into that fugue state where he's convinced he's still refighting the original battles from 400 years previously, and he madly pursues the banner across the land, buying Duke Guion time to muster the rest of his forces so that he can hold off against the Red Duke at the Battle of Seren Fields. The battle then takes place, and one of the key features of the battlefield, both in the background here and in the campaign pack, is a tomb for a Grail Knight that came in the box set that was supposed to be set up in the middle of the battlefield, and part of the reason why it suggested the Duke, under the advisement of Lady Iselda, sets up battle at this location, is the presence of this Holy Knight's tomb that will undo much of the Red Duke's magic and prevent him from casting his more potent spells. In the campaign pack, it's just implied that it's the basic divinity that is the reason why, the basic sort of sanctity of the Holy Knight that is the reason why this works. What is nice in the novel is there's a much greater reason that's suggested. The individual in the book is, in the campaign pack, is just some unknown Grail Knight. The implications in the book is that it is not, in fact, simply some unknown Grail Knight that is interred within this tomb, but rather it is the body of one of the descendants of Duke Guion. In fact, not simply one of the descendants, but a son that the Red Duke never knew his wife had born whilst he was away on the Crusades. Although she died during his rise from the dead, Her son did not. Instead, he became a wandering knight, righting wrongs, trying to put right what his father had caused. Eventually finding and seeking and finding the Grail, becoming this Holy Grail Knight, and being interred there in sight of his father's tomb by Duke Guion, by the original Bretonnian king. And it's when confronted with the truth of the fact that the bones he was seeking to defile are those of his own son, the child born by his beloved wife, that just drives all heart from the Red Duke. And although he slays Duke Guion, his army collapses when he flees the field. Rumours have suggested that he is run down and hunted by questing knights. The way the book tells it is the feuding knights, the Baron and the surviving member from the feuding family, were the only ones to know the exact route at which he had gone. And Iselda, the Grail Damsel, with her dying breath, having been mortally wounded by the Red Duke, prophesied that only the two of them working in consort could finally bring the Red Duke's evil to an end. Unfortunately, the Baron of the household that has otherwise been slaughtered wonders how it is that the feuding family came to be aware of the Red Duke's rising, and is the recipient of a deathbed confession of his own from one of the peasant servants of the feuding knight. Finally becoming aware that all of this tragedy is the fault really of his enemies, of this other feuding family, he stabs the last surviving member of the other family, this other knight who had until this point been his uneasy companion, murdering him essentially, says he'll go off and seek the Red Duke on his own. But as the Iselda has prophesied, he's never heard from again because he does not have that other knight at his side. And so it's from that point really that the story comes to an end with the stranger revealing himself to be the Red Duke and suggesting to the troubadour that he will offer the troubadour the choice that he himself was never offered. The book ends with the suggestion that from that point on the troubadour was treated as a raving madman, that his sanity fled him essentially, although he turned down the Red Duke's offer. Seeing and being confronted by the truth and being confronted by this dread and eldritch monster drove all sanity from his mind, and he wandered the rest of his days as a lunatic, raving about the return of the Red Duke, who was widely ignored until the day that warning finally came to fruition. So, yeah, a great piece of background, a great campaign pack. Like I said, it's one that I've actually played through. When I played it through back in back in my childhood, I didn't actually play against a Bretonnian army. Although my brother had a Bretonnian army, he didn't have enough for us to play the campaign pack, so I played it through against my friend Phil's Chaos army instead. We played it on a dining table with whatever bits of scenery we could get, a cloth with some books wedged under it as a hill and a pot plant as a forest. Years later, when I think it was 7th or 8th edition Fantasy had come out, I wrote my own lists based upon the then 7th edition Undead book, 7th edition Vampire Counts book, and 7th edition Bretonnia book, of how it could be refought. And my friend Greg and I refought the first two scenarios of this reimagined version. What I'm really looking forward to is Bobby from Arbiter Ian's Tale of Four Gamer series. She came to my Blood in the Badlands campaign last year. She's coming this year as well. She's got an amazing undead army. Check out my Blood in the Badlands video. You'll see some pictures of it there. Some video of my dwarves fighting against it. But she has promised that when I finish painting this Bretonnian army, she will come down here to the war room. We can then play through all of the scenarios in Circle of Blood, and when that happens I will film those as a series of videos, and you'll be able to watch the Circle of Blood that I've just told you the whole story about being refought on my own gaming table. So, thanks very much for watching. I will catch you next time. Bye for now.